right, welcome everybody to the Kidlit Distancing Social. I am Laura Backus, publisher of Children's Book Insider, the Children's Writing Monthly, and I'm very excited you're all here with me tonight. Excuse me. Okay. If you are brand new to us, first of all, welcome. So glad you're joining us this week. If you would like to hear about all of our guests for the Kidlit Distancing Social, as well as other things that we have going on with Children's Book Insider and the various arms of my company, webinars and other things that we have going on, you can get on our list by going to writeforkids.org/ultimate-cheat sheet, and you will get a free ebook. This is our 30th year in business. In fact, this April will be the last month of our 30th year. Starting in May, we're starting our 31st year in business. Oh my gosh. So this sort of compiles all of our best beginner advice from 30 years into this ebook, and it's yours for free if you get on our list and find out about all the other stuff we're doing. And if you're interested in subscribing to my newsletter, Children's Book Insider, we have a special price for our socialites, just $5 a month, writeforkids.org/CBI. And you'll get the newsletter delivered to your inbox every month. It's about 20 pages a month. You will have access to our members-only website, the CBI Clubhouse, which houses a lot of that 30 years worth of information. And in the newsletter every month, we have marketing information, what publishers are looking for, literary agents, how to submit to them, magazines. We also have a special editor or agent spotlight interview every month where they give us an above the slush code. So our CBI subscribers can submit to them for a period of time using this code, and their manuscripts will jump over the slush pile, which is an awesome, awesome perk. So $5 a month, writeforkids.org/CBI. Now we have our celebrate section. Yay! This is where we get to celebrate your wonderful accomplishments. And I have 3 great celebrates this week. Pat Donna writes that her first self-published picture book, Delmar the Dinky, about a little trolley, will be released on Amazon in May. And look at that cover. Isn't that awesome? So congratulations, Pat. Arlene Mark, who is a longtime CBI subscriber, had her story, Big News, Little News, about a newspaper boy on a bike and how the paper he's delivering is closing, published in the March issue of Highlights for Children magazine. Congrats, Arlene. That is a really prestigious publishing credit, and it sounds like the story is very timely as well. And another longtime subscriber, Jen Funk Weber, has had her newest book, The Puzzler's Guide to Alaska, Games, Jokes, Fun Facts, and Trivia About the Last Frontier, is being released today from West Margin Press for ages 8 and up. And she writes, it's my 18th puzzle book, and it's the one I imagined publishing more than 25 years ago when a homemade puzzle book earned a full scholarship to the Highlights Foundation Writers Workshop at Chautauqua. So that is like double congratulations there, Jen. Thank you for letting us know those details. See, you can hang on to a dream for 25 years and have it come true. That's awesome. But puzzle books, how many of us even think about that as a viable market? Clearly Jen did. She's done 18 of them, and it sounds great. It's not just puzzles. It's all sorts of great information in there. So congratulations to all of you. I want to hear your good news. We talked about this before I started recording. Those of you who have things to celebrate, please email me at mail@writeforkids.org and put the word celebrate in the subject line, and I'll feature you on a future Kidlit Distancing Social. And send me as many details as you can. If there's a book cover, please send the cover. JPEG, you could attach it to the email. I love to show the covers of your books. If it appears in a specific issue of a magazine, you want to send me a picture of the magazine, that's fine too. Anything you'd like to send, and we will help you celebrate. No celebration is too small. Okay, this is an interesting link of interest this month, and there's a lot of text here on the page this week, rather. I'm going to sum it up for you because you don't really need to know all this stuff because I give you a link. But this is a writing competition that I wanted to tell you about because the deadline is April 18th. So normally I would save this for my newsletter, but my next issue doesn't come out till May. So Science Me a Story Writing Competition. This is sponsored by the Society of Spanish Researchers in the United Kingdom. Interesting group. And it's a writing competition with the aim of promoting science in a fun and engaging way to readers ages 6 to 12. So the goal of the contest is to explain a science concept or an achievement or a method, something really interesting to kids through a short story or a poem, something with a narrative format. And so you can enter in either English or Spanish, whatever you write in as your native tongue, you may enter it in that language. And the award for each category, there will be a story and poetry, the two categories. Whoops, sorry. There will be a winner of £200, British pounds, and of course it'll convert to dollars when they send you the money, and two runners-up of £150 and £100. And it will be published online in two different places. The online magazine Principia, which publishes stories in Spanish, and the Literature Hub at the University of Liverpool. Woo. So anyway, I just thought that was cool, and some of you who are writers of nonfiction or interested in science might want to take a crack at this. So full details, go to this bit.ly link, bit.ly/Science Me a Story. The name of the competition, Science Me a Story. And remember, the deadline is April 18th at 11:59 p.m. London time. Remember that. So I would get it in like by the 17th, just to be on the safe side. Good luck to everybody. Let me know if you win. We will celebrate. Okay, now I get to welcome my very cool and guest. So Jennifer Brody, who also writes under the name Vera Strange, is an award-winning author of 10 books, including the 13th Continuum Young Adult Trilogy, the Disney Chills Middle Grade series, and the newest title, which is Be Careful What You Wish For, is actually released today. So there's a celebration. Jennifer has a new book out today, which is awesome. And 2 graphic novels for adults, which I think also probably have a young adult crossover audience. The horror sci-fi Spectre Deep Six and the dystopian 200, both illustrated by Eisner-winning artist and syndicated cartoonist Jules Rivera, which has prompted Forbes to call Jennifer a star in the graphic novel world. Very cool. Her books have been published in several countries, and many are also being packaged for feature film and TV with a number of high-level industry partners. Interesting. We can ask her about that. She's a graduate of Harvard University, a film and TV producer and writer, and a creative writing instructor. So ask her really tough questions, please. She began her career in Hollywood, working on many films, including the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Golden Compass. Awesome. Remember, if you have questions for Jennifer, please put them in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of our chat. So Jennifer, welcome. Come on and join us. And I'll stop sharing.
Hi, Laura.
Hi. I'm stopping my slides. There we go. Thank you so much for joining me. By the way, we had comments in the chat box earlier that your hair was cool. We wanted to just...
I was like, I'm going to make it look better. Just wait. Well, you know, it's like working at home, being at home, messy bun time.
Oh, yeah. None of us are dressed from the waist down. It's okay.
No, I know. I was like, I'm wearing glorified pajamas.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, that's okay. We don't mind. We're very casual here at the social. So what you write a lot of really interesting stuff, and I was really excited to have you on because we haven't talked about a lot of these genres and speculative fiction really in general yet on the social. So I just think it's a really interesting topic. So for those of you who don't know, who might be new to the writing world, speculative fiction is it's a very broad term that encompasses several genres that do not fully belong sort of within the classic sci-fi or fantasy genre. So they're kind of like maybe mixing some genres, or they borrow elements of this and this and this and kind of mash it together. Um, but at the core of the definition of speculative fiction is to speculate. For example, what if this happened? That's kind of, I feel, where a lot of these books begin. And it seems like that's where a lot of your books start off. Is that kind of how you come up with these stories, is just asking these really huge, interesting questions and seeing where they take you?
Pretty much you nailed it. Yeah, the what if usually is what leads me down a rabbit hole to exploring an idea. I mean, speculative fiction is a term that gets bandied around a lot. I think it has something to do with Margaret Atwood. She doesn't like it if you say she's a sci-fi writer. She prefers speculative fiction. And I think there's somewhat of a bias in certain
Mhm.
arenas against genre writers, because I actually think I write genre, which is sort of what you're touching on. Or I
Right.
sci-fi or horror or a blend or spec fiction. For me, they're kind of all the same, and I don't really look down on the writers. I actually think some of the greatest writers of all time write this kind of stuff. I would stack Ray Bradbury's prose against any literary titan who's won a Nobel Prize or a Pulitzer. Just
Mhm.
reread Fahrenheit 451. His prose is absolutely gorgeous and glorious. I mean, Margaret Atwood is a phenomenally talented writer. I think Stephen King is our Charles Dickens, even though he never will win those fancy literary awards. So I think that that's somewhat where speculative fiction comes from. But yeah, at the core of it, it is about asking questions.
Mhm.
Usually, a what if. And I find with sci fi, there's this idea that you're writing about the future, but we're actually not writing about the future. Science fiction is always in dialogue with the present, right? We're actually
Ah,
writing about the present through a lens of speculative fiction to look at a projection of what could be if we follow certain paths. Usually, it's often a warning about the
hmm.
future. So, and if you look at different waves of sci fi and the preoccupations of it, it usually corresponds to what's going on politically or in the world. For example, we saw when, with the last presidency, a lot of resurgence of 1984, Handmaid's Tale, these books shot up the bestseller list. I was like, 1984 sold out at Amazon in like, the so long after it published, but because it was still relevant to a cycle of what was going on politically and people were relating to these books, even though they were written quite a while ago, you can see even the popularity of Handmaid's Tale, the television show, and how powerfully that resonated with viewers, with folks who felt that it was really teaching or had something powerful to say about this modern moment in time. So I think
Mhm.
that's one of the cool things is the best speculative fiction has a timeless quality. It doesn't
Mhm.
really age the way some other fiction does or can if it's done
Mhm.
well or if they're really seeing something important. The creepiest thing or the weirdest thing is when you write these what ifs and then they start to come true and you're like, no, I didn't want this. I literally
Yes.
had a project on my slate, my film slate, that's a horror movie, fully packaged, but it's based on a short story I wrote years ago, but it's a pandemic virus story. And we actually
Hmm.
had to rewrite the script to adjust to the way the world, we were like, wow, people know a lot more about viruses now than they did a year ago. So we had to adjust to the world catching up. Or even in that graphic novel 200 you mentioned, it's based on a short story I wrote years ago. And when my artist was illustrating, there's a huge plot point in this future where everyone wears medical masks and face masks. She was like, how did you know that this is what it was going to be? And I was like, I don't even remember I wrote that in, but it's a huge point in the story. And she actually had to physically draw it. She was like, this is so crazy, as we're all having
Mhm.
to wear masks in the present. So
Mhm.
it's fascinating. But yeah, most of my stories do start from a what if question or a thematic idea that I then take and start to world build around, because characters are product of world. So until you know the world, you can't know who lives in the world, and then next is character, and then story. So that's usually my process.
Okay, that's great because that was going to be one of my questions was what comes first, the world, the characters. So the world building, and that's, which is not the way you would do it if you were writing contemporary fiction. You would most often start with the character, or at least their intimate surroundings. Yeah,
Totally. I actually teach this.
yeah.
I teach my intro to novel. I do one whole workshop on world building in place as character in novel. And what I always say to my students is even if you're writing contemporary fiction, you're still crafting a world that exists for the purposes of the book. It's not
Hmm.
necessarily the real world. I always say like Sex in the City, right? The Candace Bushnell novel, this TV show.
Sure.
Does that version of New York City exist anywhere? Has it ever existed? No, right? Like it's a fairy tale. Does it work for the purposes of the story? 100%, right? The story is
Hmm.
this New York, but I've been to New York many times. No writer has that closet or shoe collection.
Okay.
He can afford that, whose creative class, so we all know that that's not an accurate portrayal of New York City, but the fairy tale aspect and the way it functions in the story works for the purposes of the story. With contemporary, you're just shortcutting the world building because you already know the world. So you're just kind of
Mhm.
taking this little shortcut, but you still have to craft, even if you're writing like a middle grade novel set in a middle school, you have to build the world of the middle school. How many different types
Mhm.
of schools are there? How many different social hierarchies and structures varying where you are in the country, varying between what high school it is, who's popular, who's not. So you have to craft still a world for your story, but the burden on world building gets a lot bigger the further we abstract from the contemporary. So I actually
Mhm.
shove historical fiction in with the epic genres. And I think writing historical fiction is almost the same as writing fantasy because you have to tell us everything about the world. I've been
Uh-huh.
reading the prequel to Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. Pillars of the Earth, one of my
Mhm.
absolute favorite books of all time, but it takes place in the Middle Ages. So you have to tell us everything about that. Like, how do you make food? Where do you get it? Even little things about just the everydayness of the life. It's totally different in a lot of ways from how we live now. So the further we abstract or go into alternate universe, the more work you have to do up front to build that world. But I actually think that's really fun, which is part of why I love doing it. It's very challenging, but it's super fun.
Yeah, yeah. So you said earlier that consider yourself more of a genre writer than a speculative fiction. You're mixing these. Are there certain conventions of each genre that the writer needs to be aware of and honor, that the readers are expecting, or can you just sort of make it all up as you go along?
I always say I get paid to make stuff up, or that Disney pays me to scare children. Like those are like Disney pays me to scare children. Um, I think it is really important to know, yes, the arena, even if it's not spec fiction or sci-fi, if you're writing romance novels, boy, you better know what's going on, right? You better have read them. You better be familiar with the structure. There's huge expectation readers have coming to those. And there are
Mhm.
beautiful books like Outlander. Outlander is the Diana Gabaldon novel. That is a romance novel at the
Mhm.
heart, but it's a blend of what fantasy, historical fiction, two different time periods. It's a
Mhm.
amalgam, but at the core, it really is a romance novel. It is
Mhm.
romance first. I would say
Right,
Star Wars is fantasy first. It's actually space wizards. It's actually more fantasy than it is sci-fi. Like the Force, that's magic, right? Um,
right, right.
versus there is what I call harder sci-fi. But I think if you're writing any of these, yeah, you should really be familiar. If you're writing YA, you should know, like, you better have read Twilight if you're going to write vampires, but you better have read Anne Rice before that. And I
Mhm.
think with sci-fi in particular, you should know the titans of the genre, the H.G. Wells, the Jules Verne, the Ray Bradburys, the Stephen Kings. And
Mhm.
if you don't know them, the Margaret Atwoods, Octavia Butler is phenomenal and having a beautiful resurgence right now. I'm a huge fan of hers. And versus if you're doing fantasy, you need to know Lord of the Rings, right? Lord of the Rings is the first modern fantasy novel. Almost every fantasy novel, including a Game of Thrones, is heavily in dialogue with Lord of the Rings at all times. Sci-fi
Mhm.
dialogue with Asimov. And so I find if you're writing in these arenas, yes, the readers tend to know these works. I mean, they're very important. And if you're not aware, you can either stumble into things or make mistakes. And I see this a lot where there's a big movement with literary fiction, right? So it's just,
Mhm.
I try to explain it. When I first started writing, I thought it was like, oh, the fancier writers, but it's just another category. Like literary fiction
Mhm.
has its own tropes, its own preoccupations, right? They aren't necessarily the better writers, but they're writing the style. There's been a big
Mhm.
movement for literary fiction writers to come into sci-fi, to come into fantasy. You can see Marlon James, who won the Man Booker Prize, just wrote his huge fantasy trilogy. Anthony Dewar, who did All the Light We Cannot See. I know Anthony, and I know he's worked on this for a while, but his next book has a huge sci-fi component in outer space on a generation ship, which I was really pushing
Wow.
him to write. I'm so thrilled he announced it coming out next. But why are they moving into these arenas? Well, what's where the money is? You know, there's a lot
Mhm.
more money in these categories. Literary fiction tends to have a smaller audience of readership.
Mhm.
These tend to be the more commercial arenas. But I do find, and that those authors are amazing. But a lot of times when writers are coming into it without the foundation, I find their work lacks some of the knowledge or the understanding, which is I think what you're getting at. You know,
Right.
and it's the same in
Mhm.
the children's category. Like you better know A Wrinkle in Time, I think, which is it might be one of my favorite books of all time. It was huge and
Mhm.
I think Madeline Lingle way ahead of her time, way ahead.
Oh yeah, she absolutely was. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a book you find. I found it in middle school and I read it and reread it and reread it.
Mhm. Well, and I think you made a good point that as writers, you need to know the founders or the real grandmasters of the genre because your readers will know them. Your readers will probably have read A Wrinkle in Time and all these other great authors. And
I'm in the middle of a rewatch. Well, but great readers make great writers, right?
mhm,
Usually we come
exactly.
to writing because we fall in love with reading, or at least that's how it is for me. And I think most writers, you fall in love with it because it's so hard to write a book. It's like the hardest thing in the world. You better love
Mhm.
it. But where do you fall in
Yeah.
love with books? Well, by reading them.
Mhm. Exactly. Exactly. So let's talk a bit about your Disney Chills series. Um, can you tell us first just the concept, which I think is awesome, and then how did you land that gig? It seems like it would be a really coveted gig for writers.
Um, Definitely. So there is a backstory, but Disney Chills is a new brand and book series that I crafted for Disney. I do write under the pen name Vera Strange for that series for a couple of reasons. One was just to distinguish it from my other work, but another reason is that it really is Goosebumps meets Disney. That's really the pitch. It was taking Disney villains, and in my opinion, Disney has the greatest villains. I mean, so many. You can't go wrong, and so each book involves a different Disney villain haunting contemporary children. So we're actually taking these villains and putting them into the contemporary world. They are for middle grade readers, technically 8 to 12, although the adult readership on them is pretty huge. Disney has such a following and fan base. And I try to write not, when I write for younger readers, I don't write down. I try to rank the books sophisticated, interesting, craft good arcs. So I'm not surprised that adult readers can enjoy them as well. And a lot of this comes from my love. I love scary. I love horror. I loved Goosebumps growing up. And before that, Christopher Pike, R.L. Stein is amazing. And so the
Mhm.
name in part was also to maintain for this age of reader because they can still believe what creepy person wrote these books. Who is Vera Strange? We wanted to have this of disbelief around who wrote these books because they are pretty scary and every book has a dark and terrible ending. I always talk about that, which I think really surprised everyone in the beginning. They're like, what? It's Disney. We expect happily ever after. And you're giving us unhappily ever after. And I was like, yep. And every book, Disney's really given me a lot of leeway to do that, which has been really fun for me. So that's kind of the series itself. And this is the one that just came out today, which is the Cruella DeVille from 101 Dalmatians. And this is Time to Go. There's a new movie coming with Emma Stone playing Cruella. So there's a lot of
Wow.
Cruella coming out. So we timed this to go along with that film. And honestly, she was the scariest one I've written so far. And I'm writing book 6 now. She was scary even for me. I was like, Cruella's freaky.
She is a scary, scary human being, Corella. Yes, I'm not sure she's human, but
Yeah,
yes.
Like for the time I wrote Hades from Hercules, and he was a blast. Like that one was just super fun because Hades is funny. Like Hades is a good, like he's a good time. Corella, I was just like by the end of this book, I was like, this is even freaking me out now.
I
So
know.
series. So the way that it came about originally was that I did know an editor at Disney who published books by a friend of mine, and I think I met him originally at one of her book signings, and he was there, and we just hit it off. And then when they were thinking of doing this series, they wanted to do a Disney Villains middle grade series. He hit me up and said, would you like to audition for this? You know, I thought of you right away. And I think I did audition some other authors from my understanding, but I wrote, they were first like, what villain do you want? I was like, well, Ursula from The Little Mermaid. I mean, if I really am going to pick, she's a sea witch, she's a diva, she's so fun. I absolutely love Ursula. So I auditioned my writing, I want to say about 2.5 chapters. I pitched some ideas, wrote the chapters, and they ended up hiring me and offering me a 3-book deal. And at the time, I did ask them, I was like, why did you hire me over all these other writers? And they said, you write great middle grade voice. Your middle grade voice is so strong. And I was laughing. I was like, well, I just remember how horrible middle school was. And I just leaned into the angst. This is all the angst, right? I was like, does anyone have a good time in middle school? I don't know. Maybe they do, but I don't understand.
I don't remember having a good time. No.
Challenging, like coming of age. I love writing middle grade. I actually prefer it to YA. I think it's such a fun age to write. I love the readership. I think it's just a beautiful time to explore. Because at the end of the day, you're writing coming of age stories. If you're writing middle grade or YA, at the heart of everything, you're always writing coming of age. It's just part of the genre and part of the category. So that's why they hired me, aside from the dark and creepy. And after I started working on it, my editor was like, I really can't imagine anyone else writing this series except for you. And I was like, is that a compliment? I'm gonna take it as a compliment because you're paying me. He was like, they're so dark and creepy. Nobody else could have done this. And I was like, yay. Wow. The series has been kind of wild because they gave me the 3 books. And after I delivered the second book, they went ahead and gave me another deal extending the series to 5. And this was about over a year before publication. And my editor was like, I've never seen someone given 5 books out of the gate this far out of publication, because usually they'll wait for it to publish, see how it does, see if they want to do more. And this was like crazy schedule. Like we have 3 out this year. I literally have 4 books that published this year, and I just signed a new deal to do 2 more. So the series is going to go to 7 books now. So it's been exciting. I love working for Disney. It's a dream come true. I would love to do more work for Disney. It's just absolutely, like, as a kid, I look back and I'm like, wow, you know, I can't believe I get to do this now for my job. It's awesome.
That's so great. So you talked about middle grade voice. Do you have a way to sort of explain the difference between a middle grade and a young adult voice? Or is that something that just kind of instinctively comes to you?
I
Is
think
there a different way you approach the writing?
well, with any character I'm writing, I always try to get real deep. I mean, I think voice and character is the heart of everything, even though I'm known for world building, and you have to do that because character is a product of the world. And I do even with Disney Chills, with each book, I'm really trying to channel in the core and the theme of the original film and take it into import it into different contexts. So I do start with kind of a meditation on what is at the core, what is this villain really about? And so the character kind of comes out of that, but I really try to craft and get real into their heads. Like it's almost like you have to channel and cipher into the individual. So even within a middle grade context, each character in each of my books is a different individual, you know? And so like, I remember when I was writing the Captain Hook, the 3rd one, at some point, my character Barry, I was like, oh, Barry's just not actually that smart. Like he's just like a normal kid. Like usually I've written a lot of characters that are excellent in some way at something or excel. And at some point I was like, Barry's just, he's not smart. He's just not extraordinary in any way. He's just a normal kid. And I was like, wow, I really haven't just written a normal kid. This is actually really fun. I like Barry. Like he's a great character. So I try to meet the characters on their own terms. In terms of middle grade versus YA, you know, middle grade, it's a little bit younger, you know, a little more innocent in certain ways. It's a little more dealing with parents, dealing with more rules. That age 8 to 12, you have a little less freedom. In YA, often you're going to be 16, you might be driving, you're going to be maybe doing some things with your friends that might skew a little more adult. Whereas in middle grade, they're still not that into like love or romance. Like it's still an age where boys aren't necessarily wanting to kiss girls. Um, so it's just a little bit different, but there's a beauty in that because they are starting to get a little more freedom. It's like that Stranger Things vibe. Like maybe they can get out on a bicycle and their friendships are starting to change and grow, and they're starting to have to grow up too by going to middle school or being in middle school. So I find it's just a really fun age to write. There's still an innocence to it. Whereas I think even in this world, like young adults are exposed to so much now. There is a lot more adult stuff going on if you're in the young adult space. And that just corresponds also to what's going on in the world, right? If you're 16, 17, how much these kids have been through now, in the last year or two with the presidency, the elections, the pandemic, they're dealing with a lot of really adult things that they're not sheltered from the way that maybe a younger kid might be.
Sure, sure. And also, at least in sort of my observation, middle grade characters, I don't want to make vast generalities here, but tend to be more sort of inward focused because they are so angsty. They're very self conscious. They're very, everybody's looking at me,
Well, yeah,
And YA, they're starting to
is
look
so
out.
I mean, this book is about a girl who Disney gave me permission to write a single mom. I was so stoked they let me do that because I asked. I like to do a lot of representation as much as possible to diverse youth experiences in my book. And they aren't that well off, but her mom has managed to get her a scholarship to a really good private school because, to help her. But the character is having to come in, though, to a school with a lot of rich kids who have all the latest, because it's Corella, right? So we're dealing with the fashion, have all the latest fashion that she can't afford, like designer labels. And and they're all over. In our book series, I created a social media platform called Pick Perfect, which is obviously a take on Instagram or whatever platform kids are using. And there's just all that comparison and self-consciousness. And kids are so aware of all those things now. And so this book is really a meditation on that and the social pressure of trying to fit in and what that looks like, especially if you don't have the means to do so. And into a new situation. But I think that's so relatable for kids these days, especially even the bullying that can come along with that, even when they're not in school. It used to be because I'm old, like when I was in school, it didn't come home with you, but now with social media for kids, it comes home with them. It's like 24/7, and it's really anonymous. It used to be you had to go up to someone's face. Like, I mean, I definitely got picked on when I was younger, but someone had to kind of do it to your face. It wasn't so anonymous. And now I think with anonymity, it can be, people are just harsher. They're not as kind, if they're under this shield. So, I mean, what I like about it though, is that these books are relatable for kids and they're giving them something that they're experiencing, but then this shows empathy toward that experience. And I think reading can help you feel not as alone. When you read stories and you relate to characters, it can really alleviate some of those alone feelings, which I think is what you're getting at, the internal. They show that readers have much higher scores on empathy tests. Because if you read, it actually increases your empathy for other people.
Yeah.
And I think for kids especially, and I also just think with, I love this book series because it really, really appeals to reluctant readers and boys. Boys are the hardest to reach, by the way. And just
yes,
it's the hardest to get to read. And my series, including my original 13th Continuum series, I have a lot of fans that are 8 to 12-year-old boys. The most fan mail I get, 8 to 12-year-old boys, which I think is amazing. But anything that can get them reading is a bonus. It's like such a plus because you can make a lifelong reader if you just get them hooked. And Harry Potter, I always say, created a generation of readers. Like when my YA books came out, so many of the kids who had grown up with Harry Potter were my big fans coming, and they started with Harry Potter, but it's like a gateway to discovering more reading and to falling in love with reading. So that's part of why we are really excited about books like this, and Goosebumps before it did that, where even reluctant readers would get excited and get into it. So I don't know, I think reading is the best thing you can get kids to do.
No, I totally agree, and that's awesome.
I mean, look at what you do. That's pretty much. Well, yeah, and look at what you're doing. I mean, I think if you can get kids reading, there's nothing better for them. In every.
I totally agree.
So it's
Yeah.
that's why some people like that. All the children's writers are like, people look down at us, like, when are you going to write an adult story? I'm like, well, I do write adult stories, but also I'll always write children's category. There's nothing more
Hmm.
important than writing for younger readers.
Yeah, totally. I want to talk real quick about your graphic novels, and then we'll take some questions. And any of you who have questions, I see there's some in the chat box. If you could please put those in the Q&A so I don't lose them, because the chat box will start going by pretty quick. So your two graphic novels that are out now, I know you've got more in the works, but Spectre 6 and 200. I have 200 here. Yes,
Yeah, we're twins. Yeah, this
yay.
book came out in February.
Yes, I love it. And now these are really written for an adult audience. Is that correct? Even though, like I said, I'm sure teens have found them and read them too. But they're really sort of,
Well, I think comics and graphic
great.
novels are so popular. I mean, and at the heart, I mean, Marvel, those are adult characters for the most part, but where do you find the middle grade teenagers love this kind of
Right.
stuff? 200 does skew a little more adult in terms of the content for sure. But at the same time, I always read up, and
Yeah.
I was reading Stephen King and Anne Rice. So I do think that there are a lot of readers of these that absolutely are. Inspector Deep
Oh,
Stick,
sure.
like more like a superhero story. So absolutely.
Right. And they're fascinating concepts that the stories are based around, which I love. So, can you give us a little bit of an idea of how writing a graphic novel is different from writing a novel? Do you
Absolutely.
approach the story differently?
It's a whole
Hmm.
different process. I mean, originally what happened is I'm just a fan. Usually this is how it works for me. I'm like, I love this thing. I want to do this thing because I love it. So I love comics. And I think graphic novel is a really, really cool medium, which is this idea of more novelistic comics. That's what a graphic novel is really. Because back in the day, it was all serialized. And then now
Hmm.
we're seeing graphic novels that I think are getting really sophisticated. It's not just plain superhero stuff. We're seeing, honestly, comics is very heavily like middle-aged white dude
Yeah.
territory, but I think we're starting to see more diversity come in. I will say, like, when I first got into it, and I almost always hire artists that are women or people of color, and in my film packaging, same thing. And we were like, wow, there's like no women who do this, like
Yeah.
very few. And then when we get into women of color, like my artists, oh my gosh, there's almost nobody. So it was interesting trying to get in. And the comic industry is very myopic, it's very insular. But what we're seeing right now is a lot of the major book publishers, the major publishers are starting to get into graphic novel. They've realized these are hugely popular with younger readers. There's a
Hmm.
huge audience for them, but it's also kind of new territory for them because they're not very experienced. And then there's the comic book publishers, but a lot of them are sort of held together by duct tape and like have no marketing budgets, have no budgets to really pay anyone. And the bigger companies like DC and Marvel kind of do more of their own IP. That's kind of like the Disney of it all. So it's kind of this interesting arena, but I think it's an exciting time to work in this area. So basically, I just was like, I want to do this. I had originally 200 was the first idea I was working on. It's based on a short story I wrote years ago that was published about what if you could live forever. There's a cure for aging and illness. It's given to everyone on Earth. It's egalitarian. I'm sick of tropes and rationings. Only the rich get it. I'm like, no, it's literally like a vaccine. You're not immortal. You can still get hit by a bus and die, but you're gonna live forever. You don't age. You don't get sick. But then what happens is when people start to hit about 200 years old, even though the human body is now built for immortality, the human mind isn't. So people start to lose it mentally, basically, and the rampages start. And so the solution is that now when you turn 200, you must take a test, and that test will determine if you have the mental capacity to handle immortality or you must be euthanized. It is dystopian, but I also say this is a pretty good deal. You'd probably take this deal. 200 years, you're not going to
Yeah.
age, you get sick. It's better than you get right now in a lot of ways. But the heart of the book is about a marriage, a long-term marriage, and should it continue? And if one partner was sick and one wasn't, would you want your partner to have a life beyond you? And it really sits on that. And this idea of even if you could live forever, would you really want to live forever? It kind of turns on that. So I always thought the story had a lot of potential to expand it into a longer work. And I thought graphic novel would be a really fun way to kind of expand the short story I'd written. And I met Jules. She was an artist on a panel I moderated for Anacon, and she was just a burst of energy. And I was like, I loved her indie sci-fi comics and approached her about working together. And then while we were working on this, I had this other idea, which became Spectre Deep 6, which was about if elite soldiers die in the line of duty, but they're reanimated by military scientists and brought back as ghosts, actual specters, to continue to carry out missions for the government in exchange for day passes to haunt their old lives and fix their unfinished business. So it's like a team of 6 ghost agents, which was really fun. We just got a Stoker Award nomination, and that was our debut, which is really exciting to get recognized for the first time with a graphic novel. So it's been really cool. But the process involved us doing 2 different book proposals, which includes, there's a way to do it, but I'm sure you've talked about book proposals before, but it has like a summary, sample script pages, sample art spread, usually about 5 pages, bios, things like that. And we shopped the 2 proposals, and my publisher, who had done my Continuum trilogy with me, loved both of them, it turned out. I thought we'd be lucky to sell one. I was like, we'll see how this goes. And they were like, we can't pick, we want them both. So we sold them both in 3-book deals. So they're supposed to be trilogies, although we're behind schedule on doing the sequel to Spectre. But now that we got the Stoker nomination, and we just attached a great directing team for feature film adaptation, I think there's going to be a lot of interest in doing the second book. But I just got really busy with Disney. Jules is doing a syndicated comic called Mark Trail that's in a bunch of newspapers. I think it's like 70 years old. She's the second only syndicated Latino cartoonist ever. So we've just been busy in our own arenas.
Right.
But hopefully we'll come back to our little ghost babies, our little ghost soldier babies. But yeah, graphic novel is super fun. I recommend it. And I know it's a really growing area.
Yeah. So when you write the script, now you were working with your illustrator pretty closely, which some writers won't have that luxury if they submit to a publisher who they just submit the text and then the publisher wants to find the illustrator. But either way, what does your text look like? Do you put art notes in it for the illustrator in a graphic novel?
There's a way that a graphic novel script is done. So that's a great question. So it is a little bit, I'm sure you've covered picture books and children's picture books. A lot of times they actually prefer that you not have an artist when you right? And it actually is the same in comics and graphic novels. I'm a little different in that I really prefer to have a lot more control over who I work with. And it was important to me as part of the process. For me, it almost feels like when I'm making a movie and I'm working with a director, the artist is the director, you're the writer, they're the director. So, but a graphic novel script looks a lot like a screenplay for a movie, because it's really just a template to show the artist what to do. So it starts out where it's broken out by page, and I'll say page 1, and then you do the panels, panel 1, and there'll be a description of what it looks like, and then dialogue and sound effects even. And then usually it's going to be about 4 to 6 panels a page. You can do things like full splash, where it's just one huge page. And so it kind of goes through like that. And so the script will usually be longer, because 1 page of comic script might go on to 2 pages of the writing. But it really does. But then I trust my artist a lot to come in if she sees something, especially for action sequences. And both of these books have a lot of action sequences, which Jules really excels at. So I really let her kind of have leeway on those pieces. And sometimes I might even just say, hey, this is this escape scene. Here's how I see it, and not even break it, and let her decide on the panel. But just to give, this is what a full splash will look like, where it's 1 whole page is just 1. And then this is obviously one where there's just 3 panels, but there'll be pages that have more. So I tend to like to collaborate really heavily. There probably are writers that don't want input from the artist that way, where the artists actually are more work for hired, which I didn't want to do on, and I didn't do to Jewel. I cut her in fully 50-50 on everything, but you can, in theory, have them be more hired and paid for their work, of course, but where they're not having ownership over the work the same way happens.
Right. And that very much depends on the publisher too. I think also probably because you were working with a publisher who already knew you, they might have been more open to giving you that kind of control.
Yes, and I will give Turner Publishing credit. They've been phenomenal my whole career. They took a chance on me when, I wrote a book that was a little off center, which is 13th Continuum. It kind of is more crossover. It's YA, but crossover. And a lot of publishers were wary of that and not into sci-fi. And they've really given me so much creative freedom to really bring my work to market in ways. And that's why I think the big publishers are great, but they're at the end of the day giant corporations. And there's a little bit of And that's why I think the mid-size and smaller presses are so important for writers and artists to have access to
Right.
have that creativity, the expansion that might not cookie cutter slot in to exactly what,
Mhm.
you know, HarperCollins
Yeah.
thinks or what Barnes and Noble wants or Target wants, but it's still really important storytelling.
Hmm.
So I'm a big
Yes.
advocate
Yes.
of having as many great publishers and options for writers as possible in the market.
Hmm. True. Okay, I'm going to get to some questions here. Um, and we have a lot of them based on the graphic novel, which is great because we haven't addressed that before. First of all, are there any good resources that you know off the top of your head, which is always a hard thing to ask someone, um, where people can see examples of how to format a graphic novel script and
Absolutely.
also like books on how to write a graphic novel? Anything that you can
I
recommend?
don't know that there have been a lot of books on it because this is so kind of new, is the way I mean, there's always been stuff like, I mean, I worked with Grant Morrison back in the day who wrote Batman Arkham Asylum, and why they haven't made that into a movie, I will never know. Still, I'm like, you making the Joker, and that story, in my opinion, is a weak story. I'm like, do Batman Arkham Asylum if you really want to do a great Joker movie. I think it's still the best selling graphic novel all time, but you saw them more in the context of it was still a Batman story,
Mhm.
right? So there started to be, I think Neil Gaiman started to shift things a lot. Sandman was really groundbreaking. So y'all check out Neil Gaiman. He came up in comics, but
Yeah.
he's doing pretty innovative things that weren't prototypical for what you were seeing in the Marvel or the DC comics or what we were used to. And Grant Morrison's amazing too. I just mentioned him. I love his comic We Three. I developed that as a film a long time ago. I worked with Neil Gaiman on an adaptation of his death character from Sandman. We didn't make the movie, but I did work with him back in the day on it. I love Neil Gaiman. Um, Probably he has a lot on his blog, but go to the comic publisher's website. I know Dark Horse Comics, I think, has sample scripts and will show you. So if you go to any of the big, there's IDW, Dark Horse. I don't know what DC Comics has, and they're kind of just, they just fired everyone and they're going through a reshuffle, my understanding. But there are a bunch of the other more independent companies that probably have a lot of resources. So go to the comic publisher's
Mhm.
actual website, and often they'll have instructions for if you do even want to submit. I don't think you even need to be agented for a lot of these. They'll have instructions for what you would include to submit or audition at Dark Horse, at IDW. There are other cool publishers. Boom Comics is another one that does some interesting stuff, although I've heard they keep a lot of rights. So, and that's
Mhm.
another thing that we deal with in, because I try to keep always my film and TV rights. I know this is getting a little industry. And my understanding is that Boom Comics does a pretty big rights grab. Actually, a lot of the comic publishers do, is my understanding, which is another reason I prefer publishing my stuff with the book publishers
Right.
versus the
Yeah.
comic publishers, because they're used to keeping the IP, because a lot of the money in all of this is taking that and making it into film and television, right? And we see that
Yes.
how
Hmm.
much that's worth now. It didn't used to be, but so you
Sure.
can
Yeah.
online, but I don't know about actual. I could recommend craft books on actual writing, but I don't know about comics and graphic novels. But just
Hmm.
for at the end of the day, you're still crafting a story. I'm still using essentially the same structure beats I use when I do a normal prose novel, right?
Hmm.
Another thing I always recommend to people is to get on Twitter and follow people you admire, writers you love, publishers. Just start following them all on Twitter. Follow Dark Horse, follow Neil Gaiman, follow Grant Morrison. Victoria Ying is a friend of mine, and we were going to work together, but she got too busy. She has a middle grade graphic novel out, and I think sold some more called City of Secrets. Victoria is very active on Twitter. Follow her. Cecil Castellucci writes a lot of this stuff. Follow Cecil. She's amazing, and she's written a lot of really interesting graphic novels. So there's definitely cool people to check out, and Twitter, Google
Hmm.
are your friends. But yeah, you're right.
Hmm.
Not a lot of classes get taught on this. I should do a workshop on it. I should talk to Writing Pad because I think there's so much interest in it.
There really is. And people are asking, can I put your recommendations in the chat box? When we send out the replay tomorrow, under the replay link, we'll list a lot of these publishers that Jennifer's recommended that you check out. So you'll have those there. So you just talked about as far as structuring the story of the graphic novel. So I was going to say, do graphic novels all have to have very plot driven stories? But not necessarily. I have read some graphic novels that are written more like a very sort of introspective YA novel where the characters are doing a lot of soul searching and it's very relationship based. So it doesn't have to be one specific kind of story.
No, I think it used to have to be in a way, which is
Mhm.
sort of that superhero thing we're talking about. But I think there's just been so much growth and change,
Mhm.
especially with the explosion, which all started. I mean, I was like right at the forefront of a lot of this because we had the rights to Iron Man when I was at New Line through it into our Blade deal, and we ended up losing them. But when Marvel broke off, and because Marvel went bankrupt, like their properties were worth nothing. If I told you like what we paid for the option on Iron Man, you would die because it was like so cheap. Like it is literally
Mhm.
billions of dollars now. But it wasn't then. And I think with that explosion, we started to see like a growth in mainstream interest. Because I always say, like, if you were into comics, and I got picked on for being into this stuff when I was like a younger person coming up in the 80s, like we were the nerds. Like we weren't, but now it's like
Right.
mainstream jocks are into Marvel. It's kind of disorienting in a way for me. I'm like, what? This stuff is so mainstream now, it's totally like become that way. But I think with that, you're starting to see again, like you're talking about, more interesting historical fiction, graphic novels, the YA contemporary stuff. Absolutely. And I think it is, I would say graphic novel scripts are a little bit more like writing a screenplay for a movie, though. So maybe
Mhm.
looking at like screenplays or screenplay format, I had experience with that before, made it a little easier. I'm like, it's a bit like a script. So I
Mhm.
think that it actually in
Yes.
some ways is a little more like that than it is like writing a prose novel, the actual writing crafting of it.
Well, and I was going to ask you that because you had so much experience in the movie industry before you got into this writing. Do you think that's useful for a writer to study screenplay writing just for lots of different reasons, really, even if they never intend to actually write a screenplay?
I think the more tools you can have in your writing toolbox, the better. I am a proponent of trying out a lot of things. You don't know where your strength or your love interest is going to be
Hmm.
with writing. I say at the heart, I am definitely a novelist. It's like when I write short stories, I'm like, it's great, but I just need like 100 more pages. And that's how I know
Hmm.
I'm a novelist. But there are people who excel at short story. I know some major short story writers, and they struggle to do novel. When
Right.
major, they're short fiction, there are writers that do all of the above well, Neil Gaiman being one, Stephen King being another. But yeah, there are people who are amazing. One of my best friends wrote Thor Ragnarok and Toy Story 4 and won the Oscar, and she's one of the best screenwriters I know. I don't love writing screenplays. I'll do it if I have to or if someone really wants me to. I prefer working for someone where they love screenplays. They love doing this
Sure.
stuff. My love is more novel, but I think having a familiarity with it is important. And I think there's great storytelling being done right now in especially television. And television is very novelistic, right? The great
Hmm.
shows, that's why you're seeing so many of these TV shows are actually based on books because the
Right.
way television has evolved now, it is a
Hmm.
lot more like a novel, and it's perfect for book adaptations. Like a lot of the shows that I've been watching lately are. But I think storytelling is storytelling is storytelling. So consuming good stories is important. And even when I'm teaching writing workshops, I do reference films a lot. I reference television a lot. Why? Because there's great stories being told, and a lot of them are adapted from these things. And
Hmm.
you're right. Even
Right. Right.
watch WandaVision, that's a very non-superhero story, but it is from the comics of
Hmm.
WandaVision, right? Like
Right.
Batman were the Frank Miller Batman comics, which is different than the mainstream Batman. So there is really interesting stuff going on. The Boys on Amazon, I'm friends with Derek who wrote that comic series. But again, that's a bit of a different take on superheroes.
It is very different take. Yeah, I love both of those series. Absolutely. Okay, a couple more questions here before we let you go. Gina says, I have a middle grade fairy fantasy novel coming out this month.
I love
I
fairies.
originally, yeah, I originally wrote it as a screenplay, but then decided on novel format. I have always seen this story in my mind as a Pixar type movie. How do we go about pitching our books to movie producers?
Well, I think it's really smart to start with a book as underlying IP. I would tell you that in so many of my writing workshops, I get staffed successful television writers taking my workshops to learn novel because one, it's totally different, and two, the name of the game in Hollywood is IP, intellectual property.
Intellectual property.
intellectual
Okay.
property, which is stuff based on stuff, right? So just selling a straight script is super hard, especially because the spec market collapsed essentially years ago. So it's super hard. It's super hard. Hollywood's very myopic. It's very hard to get your foot in the door. You can't just query agents the way you can book agents. But you know how you can get noticed is to write a novel first and sell that as a book. Then it starts to get way easier, at least to get seen, to get talked about, and for things that necessitate big world building. And this is part of why I started writing novels. It's a better way to really build the world and explore it, because a script is pretty bare bones in a lot of ways. Like a novel gives you a lot more leeway to, like George R. R. Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones. He was a scriptwriter. He wrote for Disney before he wrote screenplays. But a Game of Thrones could never have just been a screenplay, right? It's
Right.
big, it's too deep, it's too sophisticated, there's too many points of view. So I think having and creating IP, even short stories, is really, that's basically what I do with Hollywood now, is I write and create my own stuff, which would be like you're talking about your fairy novel. And then I look at things as being multi-platform or living in different ways. So it might be a short story that becomes a graphic novel, and then it becomes a movie, right? That's kind of cool. But the story can exist in all these different ways. So you're not limited to just one. So I think it's a really smart way to go, especially if you're doing fantasy. In terms of foot in the door in Hollywood, that's a long conversation, a bit harder, but very difficult. You kind of need to be in LA, but it's opening up more. So if you are able to get a book agent and sell your book, then it suddenly becomes a lot easier for your book agent to get you a film and television agent to shop. And there are agents that specialize in book to film, and they can tell you who they are, and they can tell you who the agencies are. It is specialized, but it's a very huge booming arena right now, which is film, book to television. And like we just talked about, how many of these television shows are we watching that are based on books?
Right, right. No, and that's a good point. If you have a literary agent for your book, and in fact, or if you're looking for an agent, what you want to do is look on their website and see if they have connections with other agents that sell their properties to the
Almost
movies and the
big ones,
TV studios.
almost all of the big ones well, or at least be able to get you in touch with someone 100%. And my book
Right.
agent, Deborah Schneider, Gelfin Schneider, has a relationship with ICM and Curtis Brown, which is for foreign.
Yeah.
But I'm actually not with ICM anymore for film and television, but I was for a while. I moved to
Yeah.
Gersh. But yeah, they will, Gersh stole me, but they will have, yeah, absolutely, they'll know people. It's a very small industry, and the people that do this tend to know each other. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And acquiring agents, book agents, you absolutely do that. There's a whole process, and it does work. You don't need connections to get agented. You don't need to live in LA. That's the other thing.
Yes. So really the key is see if you can get an agent for your book, and then they will pave the way for these other connections. And that's probably the easiest way to do it. Can you, well, we're going to move on from this, but one quick question. If someone doesn't have a literary agent, can they approach movie agents directly? Are there people, and I'm sure there's resources to figure out who these people are,
You
and say, I
can,
have this book property.
you can. Usually you're gonna have more luck with managers than the big agencies. The big
Okay.
agencies usually aren't gonna take anything unsolicited. Okay. And that's a whole
Okay.
thing. In movie studios, definitely not. We had to throw all that stuff in the trash. Like it would come in and it goes right in the trash. Like, and that's for legal reasons, for protection reasons as well.
Sure.
So it really does help managers. But I do know some managers that represent writers. I've had them call me to get advice from me about who the book agent should be, because I know more than the film and TV people. But I do know, but a lot of times screenplay writers also then write a book, and then they go to their film TV people, like, what do I do with this? And they don't know. And they're like, oh, let us talk to other people. So
Right.
Hollywood is just, it's a very, I mean, I got a film degree from Harvard and started interning at Disney at 20 years old, and started in the business at 21. My old boss made Lord of the Rings. So I kind of came up in the industry, but I had to move to LA, and it's a very myopic business, right? It's a very insecure business. And it's a tough business. It's very toxic in a lot of ways. It's getting better, but I'm sure you've all read the news, you know. So,
yeah.
But at the same time, I love movies. My first love was, it's what I wanted to do. So it's a beautiful thing to want to do. And it's possible. If you have a dream, you should go after it.
Yeah. All right, last question for you here. This is your writing instructor hat here. What is your thought and writing process? I always have ideas for children's books. I know where I want the stories to go, but I can't seem to get myself to get it down. Or I'll free write but never return to it. Note, I'm not a writer by trade or training. So I think this person is sort of asking, how do I kind of get momentum on a
Yeah,
project and just kind of keep going? Do you have any
yeah,
tricks or
I have a lot
advice for that?
on. I have a lot of thoughts on all of that. I think number one, writing's super hard. We all know that. So, don't feel bad that it's a hard thing to make yourself do. I mean, we all procrastinate. I always say procrastination is part of the process. If you do want to start, and I'm totally self-taught, by the way, I've never taken a writing class, totally taught myself how to do all of this. I teach to shortcut some of the things that were hard or the mistakes that I made to give tips. So I actually highly recommend taking workshops or classes. One, to learn a lot of craft stuff. And for example, the workshops I teach for the writing pad are really targeted towards folks that have day jobs or have other jobs going on, but still have a passion or interest in writing. And there's a couple of
Mhm.
reasons I really recommend it. One, meeting other writers, right? That's motivating, not feeling like you're alone in it. Two, learning things. And I think the major thing is structure. And I'm probably one of the only writing teachers that teaches novel structure or really heavily does. I get students coming out of major MFA programs that no one's ever talked to about structure. And I think
Yep.
that's why so many writers start a story and they get to a certain point and they're like, well, now what? I don't know what to do. What do I do? And in screenplay or script writing, the first thing you learn is structure. And I think for me,
Mhm.
it's really strange. Like any screenplay writer, even someone who's just learning, they're going to know act one, act two, midpoint. No screenwriter, you would have to really be under a rock to not learn the structure, at least know about it. Whereas in novel, they're like, I'm just going to wing 300 pages, just go wing
Right.
that. Just go write and see where it takes you. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's crazy to me without understanding that there's a way to structure and tell a story that works and will always work. So that's the other thing I really recommend learning about structure. And the other reason I recommend classes, workshops, things like your podcast are amazing. Those resources is to get yourself motivated and to have accountability, right? Because if you're showing up
Mhm.
every week to a class, if you're around people who are writing, that tends to help you be accountable and motivated to return to your story and to your work. And also just not feel so alone. And the networking's great, meeting other writers who are doing what you're doing, maybe who could beta read or trade your work with you. And the other big reason I suggest investing a little bit is just even a little bit of money in terms of like taking a class is that money is a tool that signifies intention. So, right,
Mhm.
where we spend our time and our money signifies our intention of what we want to manifest in our lives. And this is a creative thing, like we're manifesting work. So, I found that when I started doing stuff like going to the 10 House Writers Workshop, you mentioned highlights earlier. I never got to go, but always heard it was fantastic. I did a bunch of other workshops. Things started to happen for me in my work, but some of it was very internal, right?
Mhm.
In terms of building confidence and building connections. So I just really recommend anything you can do. And with the way online is, podcasts, classes being taught online, there's always resources. It doesn't matter where you live and things that will fit a budget. You'll
Mhm.
have opportunities. So that's really my big recommendations on that. And I totally relate to how hard it is to do.
Mhm.
So, like I said, I also tell my students, like, don't feel bad if this is hard because it's hard for all
Yeah.
of us, even the really successful, huge people. It's hard and it's a lot of work. So don't
Mhm.
feel bad if it's hard. How long do they
Yeah.
say to master something? Like 10,000 hours?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
I know.
Well, and I always feel like in a lot of ways it should be hard because you're creating art.
Yeah.
You're creating, when it comes to writing children's books, you are creating books that could change a child's life. It could be this pivotal moment in their life where they read this book and they suddenly don't feel alone, or it opens up their mind, or something happens and they're going to
Right.
carry that with them forever. And it should be hard to make that. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it, but then we'd have a lot more
Yeah.
crappy stuff out there than we do.
And I'll say that the thing you're saying about one story, a story can change someone's life is true. I mean, some of the letters I get are really amazing and really heartbreaking. Even people who are just feeling suicidal or feeling depressed. And I found your book and it saved me. It kept me going in a really hard time. And I always try to say it's easy for a lot of once you start publishing to get obsessed with how many copies am I selling, this and that. And I honestly don't really pay attention to any of that because they always say one reader is worth 1,000 readers is worth 1,000,000 readers. If you reach one reader, that's valuable. Don't underestimate the power a story can have on a single reader, and that in and of itself makes it worthwhile that you could impact
Mm-hmm.
about younger readers. And I love them because when they find something they love, they're not jaded like adults. They're just like, I love this.
Right.
This is my
Yeah.
favorite thing in the world. Like I got a letter from a mom today saying that her daughter just finished my second Disney Chills book with Dr. Facilier, and it's now her favorite book in the whole world. And I'm just like, oh, that's so amazing, right? Like,
Yeah. That's great.
mm,
That's great. And that makes all the hard work worthwhile
that's
when
what
you
I
get those letters.
and I just try to
Mm-hmm.
remember that at the core. And my friend Jonathan Mayberry was saying that when I was having a frustrated day of just feeling burned out, and he, because we talk all the time, he's an amazing writer, Jonathan, but he was like, and he's like hugely best-selling, etc. But he was like, just try to remember what it is that made you want to write in the first place. Like go back to the core of what made you start doing this in the beginning. If you remember that,
Mm-hmm.
it'll make everything else go away. I thought that was
Yeah. Totally true. Totally true. Well, Jennifer, this has been great. Thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight, for giving us such great advice and information and sharing so much of what you do.
Thank you. You guys asked really awesome stuff. And Laura, you're amazing. Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Yes, well, this has been great. And I'm so excited I was hoping to read your newest book before today, but it just came out today and I didn't get my hands on it yet, but it's it's on my list. It's
It
going to
did. It's out in the world. It's so crazy. Well, as you know, Laura, like a lot of times we finish these and it's about a year before it's out in the world. So it's so crazy even for me to be like, oh my gosh, look at this thing that I wrote. And look, it's like a real thing that's like here.
I
And
know.
Disney does such a fun job on the
Oh, they
type
do a
of
great job.
like
The
they just
design and everything.
they have the best
Oh,
cover designers too. I love their cover artists.
hmm, they really do. Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for sticking with us tonight, and we'll see y'all next week. All right. Good night, everybody.